Thank you, Glenn, for that really kind introduction. Normally, you wouldn't think of going to a museum for a lecture on science. But frankly, vision scientists these days think of art as a genuine science because art is ultimately generated by the human brain, and thus it must contain clues about how we see, about how perception works, about how the brain works. And the thing is, vision feels so automatic and immediate. We're completely unaware of the immense amount of processing going on in here all the time until some unexpected image takes us by surprise. Now, surreal art is, if nothing else, full of surprise, delivering perceptual, conceptual, and even philosophical contradictions that both confuse and beckon. So today I want to present to you some work by the Belgian surreal artist René Magritte, and hopefully show you some of the lessons that we can learn from art about how perception works by taking a little peek under the hood, so to speak, and thus highlighting for you your own brain's astonishing abilities. And I have a secret mission today, and that is to amplify your appreciation of art by piquing your interest in how we see and thus how art works its magic. So here's the man of the hour. Can you all hear me in the back? Good. This is a montage I put together of his works and him in the center. This painting is what launched me into this journey, The False Mirror, when I went to the Museum of Modern Art in 2014. It's such a surreal and haunting image, this giant lashless eye with an enormous iris replaced by blue sky and clouds. And we'll come back to this painting if I can at the end, because it was so inspirational to me. I frequently use this painting when I taught classes in sensation and perception. In the 50s, when the CBS network launched, they launched with this image, and Magritte sued them. So here's the man of the hour and the topic of the hour. So let's dive in. So why in the world are visual neuroscientists interested in art? Well, I've already given you a clue. But one thing I haven't told you is that we have documentation that humans have been making pictorial art for at least 40,000 years. And so today, many scientists think of it as the oldest brain science. In fact, one of my famous colleagues has said, visual art obeys the laws of the visual brain and thus reveals these laws to us. Now, the problem is what laws and how does art reveal them? And hopefully we'll begin to see a little bit of how that might work today. A little bit about Magritte himself. He was born at the end of the 19th century in Belgium, and at the age of 13, an event happened that changed his life dramatically. His mother committed suicide in the local river, and many of his works after that seem to reflect his thoughts and feelings about that terrible, traumatic incident. The legend was that he was at the river to see her pulled out with her white nightgown draped over her head. And this, to some art historians, explained why some of his pieces had faces with cloths over them. Now, the top art historians say that no, he wasn't really at the river, but this is what I say. I say a young artist with that kind of imagination, he could have envisioned his mother there with the nightgown. He didn't need to be at the river. Here's the beautiful couple on the left and a wonderful sketch that he did of Georgette. He met Georgette the year after his mother's death, and they stayed together, eventually married, and they were together until his death in 1967. You came in listening to a song, many of you, about Georgette and René. So his early works were not surreal. Many of them were impressionistic, or cubistic, like this cubistic painting of Georgette at the piano, or this cubistic self-portrait. I claim he got up on the wrong side of the bed for that one. Here's an impressionistic rendition of his close friend Pierre Bourgeois. Here's a lovely Art Deco flavored cubistic rendition of three women. I just love this painting. Its design, its clean colors and shapes. It's just beautiful to me. And as is the bather here in this, frankly, Art Deco styled work. Very simple and yet very evocative. In 1922, what I call an aesthetic epiphany happened. He was sitting in a cafe in Brussels, and one of his friends came up and opened up a magazine on his table in front of him, and there in front of him was a painting that changed everything for him. It was a black and white rendition of de Chirico's Song of Love. And Magritte wrote that he was moved to tears. He said, "It was one of the most moving moments of my life. My eyes saw thought for the first time." Think about that. And then he said, in that moment, he realized the ascendancy of poetry over art. What an idea. And he vowed that from then on, all of his paintings would be visual poems. And that's even before he saw the color version of the painting. So he wrote many times after that, the function of art is to make poetry visible, to render thought visible. And there's no painting that perhaps is more iconic of this idea than The Treachery of Images here. Ceci n'est pas une pipe. This is not a pipe. If you snipped off the words at the bottom there, it wouldn't be a surreal work at all, would it? Because it's so realistic. But what makes it surreal, and Magritte thought of the linguistic components as objects of art as well as the pipe. What makes it surreal is that the linguistics contradict the visual image. Of course, it's not a pipe. It is a representation of a pipe. He's so revered in Brussels that they named a street after him. Ceci n'est pas une rue. This is not a street. In hundreds of works after his epiphany in 1922, his visual poems blossomed. I'm going to do a survey through some briefly before we dive into specific paintings. He loved to create what he called poetic shock, namely juxtaposing together objects that were somehow related but in unexpected or mysterious contexts. And this painting is called Elective Affinities, the title of which he borrowed from a book by Goethe. Now here, many years later, here is a painting that contains an example of elective affinities. You have a stone mountaintop that somehow miraculously has turned into the shape of an eagle head directly above a nest of eggs sitting on a stone wall. And above the eagle, you have the crescent moon that reflects the shape of the top of the head of the eagle. Here is the ordeal of sleep. This is actually a painting of Georgette napping. And there is that cloth, the cloth that symbolized, some think, his mother's death. And so I'm thinking that maybe the ordeal of sleep is his ordeal, not Georgette's. And I'm being slightly funny, but it isn't funny. He probably did think of this frequently in his work. He always said visible things always hide other visible things. And when you think about it, it's an absolute truism, is it not? The most iconic example of that is the Son of Man, where the most important feature of the human form, the most expressive feature, the face, is hidden by a very visible green apple. He had a wonderful sense of humor and magic. For example, here is a painting that he painted, an artist attempting the impossible, that is, trying to paint a woman into physical existence, which apparently he succeeded in doing. This painting gave me a chuckle as well, because just the idea of the Leaning Tower being held up by a giant feather I found to be rather comical. And this painting is called Heartstring, La Corde Sensible. And I also found this to be, I don't know why, just the idea of a giant martini glass out in a field in front of blue-green mountains with an enormous cloud descending into the martini glass, I found comical. And why do I say descending? Well, you notice he's gone to the trouble of having it indent into the glass, right? And that detail imbues the cloud with weight and downward trajectory, does it not? So I was so impressed with this painting that I ran out of my house with the martini glass there. Which leads me to a necessary digression into a little bit about vision and how we see, because I want to give you some information with which to understand why some of the elements of the paintings are so interesting and provocative from a neuroscientific or visual perception point of view. So as you know, vision begins when light enters the front of the eye through the cornea and lens, the optical parts, which focus an image on the back of the eye, here. A little piece of the back of the eye is blown up. And this is the retina, which is just a very thin sheet of cells. The back of that sheet of cells contains the rods, cones, and these are the guys that absorb photons of light that initiate the visual experience. But I want to replace the cartoon version here with art. And this is a magnificent, hand-drawn, anatomical drawing by a 19th century anatomist in Italy, Ferruccio Tartuferi. And he did dissections of many eyes from various cadaver animals, and then very carefully did microanatomy, visualized them under the microscope, and then drew meticulously what he saw. And I'm telling you, this matches almost exactly what we see today with our very sophisticated technology. Now, just to give you a little context, these are the photoreceptors in the back of the eye. Light comes in this way. The big fat ones are the cones. That's for daytime vision and color vision. The thin rod-like guys are the rods, and they're only for low light levels, night vision, and they don't have any color vision at all. It's only the cones that give us color vision. Guess how many photoreceptors are in each eye? Exactly, 110 million in each eye. And that's not counting all these other neurons, of which there are millions. So that's 110 megapixels. Now, a fact that, my microphone's falling off here, a fact that surprises many people and tends to irritate artists is that there's no such thing as physical color in the outside world. Do I hear any moans, groans? No. It is generated by the cells in your eye and in your brain completely. Each of the receptors in the eye individually are completely and utterly colorblind. It's only by comparison of the signals coming out of the different kinds of cones that the retina and the brain, for lack of a better word, calculate some signal that we experience as color.
That's surrealistic in itself.
It is. It's a surreal thought. Now, we don't see with the eye, so the information from the retina works its way back to the very beginning of vision, which occurs in the back of your head. And don't panic, you don't have to memorize this stuff on this slide. This is called Visual Area 1. The only take-home message here is that conscious vision begins there, and the signals from Visual Area 1, which do very basic processing of very fundamental elements of the images on the retina, sends its signals to a whole bunch of specialized regions in the brain that are color-coded here, extracting motion or separating figure from background, recognition of faces, and so on. And this is going on all the time without our actual awareness of this kind of processing. Now, when light falls on the retina, there are only two dimensions of light. There's number of photons landing on the retina, brightness, and the wavelength composition. And the wavelength composition. That's it. But from two physical dimensions of light, we extract out many, many perceptual and experiential dimensions, such as brightness, color, contrast, texture, motion, size, location, left, right, up, and down, location in distance and depth. We identify objects, we segregate them, we segregate figure from background. We can detect visually transparency and translucency, glossiness from matte, temperature, red hot stove, a red hot poker, blue flame on the stove. We can see if a material is soft or hard visually, whether it's wet or dry, animate or inanimate motion, dangerous or not, and ultimately the aesthetic and emotional response to what we are seeing. All of that derived from two dimensions of light. We scientists think we have formalized what we call the core problem of vision, namely that any image on the retina could have been caused in principle by an infinite number of real-world scenes. And the task facing your brain is to figure out what is the correct interpretation out of all the infinite possibilities. And the only way it can do that is from visual memory and context, based on your experience throughout life, or doing perceptual experiments. I'll show you what I mean by that. So here, think of the wall there as the retina, and the images of the two people as whatever the images are falling on your retina. So of course, that's two people, right? Well, of course, all you need to do is a perceptual experiment, change your position in the room, and you see that it's pieces of scrap wood and metal. Are these zebras or horses? Well, of course they're zebras. Okay, we're going to play the video and truncate it when I tell you. This is another example. Dramatic music. So we have a note on the table and a cup. Lots of other objects on the table. Aha, that's reality. Okay, you can stop it and go to the next. There you go. Next slide, please. Oh, I'll just do it. So you see there, if you had actually been in that room and we were not restricted to the view of the videographer, there would have been no ambiguity. All you have to do is just do this and you would figure out what was going on, do a perceptual experiment, or even just switch eyes. But we were restricted to the videographer's view. So the take-home message is we don't see the world directly. There's a constant interpretation and calculation, and under some circumstances, we get it wrong, as illustrated in that little demo. Now, we have evolved to be exquisite pattern detectors, especially to detect ecologically relevant patterns, like, for example, this very, very coarse sketch of a horse. So when I show that to you, there seems to be no delay between the appearance on the screen and your perception of a horse. But in fact, your brain had to take in the information from the retina and then go to visual memory and call up horse into your perceptual experience. What about this frog? Instantly you see a frog. Or is it a horse? Or is it a frog? Or is it a horse? It's the same image, right? Now, we all know what frogs look like, and if you had never seen a frog in your life, you might have thought this was like a rotated horse. We are exquisitely tuned to pick out the human form, regardless of how much it is dissected or disintegrated or unrealistically colored. So think Braque, Greece, Duchamp, Picasso, you name it. This is by Magritte, of course. And perception of depth and distance also has to be constructed by your brain. Because remember I told you, the images falling in the retina are two-dimensional. So your brain has to construct the third dimension from the cues available. Now, one of the most important cues, as any good artist knows, is the importance of shadows. Now, occasionally, we are fooled under very artificial circumstances, and in those circumstances, we call them illusions, but these illusions contain important lessons for us about what's going on. So this is a detail of a photo I took here at the Norton in the Asian room. And when I show this to my students, and I say, what do you see? They're utterly confused. Like, I don't know, Professor, what are those eyes? I'm not sure. Is that a mouth? What are these flat surfaces? They just don't know what they're looking at until I show them the actual image. So this highlights very vividly how your brain does the best it can in using shadow information to understand 3D structure, and under some circumstances can get very fooled, creating a completely different understanding of the 3D structure of what you're looking at. You should go see this, it's magnificent. Now, as I remember I told you, Magritte always said visible things always hide other visible things. Fortunately, the Gestalt psychologists studied perception extensively, and they realized that the brain has built-in mechanisms to complete occluded objects. Thank goodness that we figured out it's a complete wolf hiding behind the tree, because the trajectory of the back part of the wolf is sort of on a glide path to the front part of the wolf, for one thing. And we also have prior knowledge about wolf structure from previous experience. One of the most important tasks your brain has to do is to dissect figure from background. And ambiguous images are good examples to show you how that under some circumstances your brain is being forced to alternate between two competing and incompatible understandings of what you're seeing. So, for example, this is the famous vase, two faces, saxophone player or a woman's face, women's legs in white stockings or men's black pants and shoes. But these are artificial figure ground bistable images. In real life, we're constantly having to segregate figure from background. And I'm going to show you an example that's quite striking that illustrates not only how strongly the brain wants to sort figure from background, but also simultaneously its drive to complete occluded objects working in tandem with the figure ground segregation. And so here's a random array of gray blobs until I cover them with an occluder. And all of a sudden your brain puts together the gray blobs and we have 5 tumbling letters B. You see that? Thank you, brain. And one more example of the power of your brain to, and the drive to connect objects is another Gestalt law, which is the law of common fate, meaning objects that tend to move in correlation, the brain assumes that they belong to one solid object. You'd think leopard stalking you behind some leaves. So I'm going to show you now what's going to appear to be a rotating square until I reveal reality to you. And here is what's really going on. Now this very, very simple demonstration has a powerful message, because no matter how hard you try, no matter how much you realize that it's not a solid square, the minute the occluders go on, you see a solid square doing this. So this is showing you your brain doing this link up. So that leads me to talk about Magritte's psychopalate. I like to think of his psychopalate instead of the physical palate, you know, what he brings from inside here to his art. And let's start our journey. By the way, this is an actual image from a human brain, a living human brain, using a non-invasive technique showing the fibers in the brain. Only a very small portion of fibers in the brain. So let's take a journey into one of Magritte's most famous paintings, The Blank Check, Le Blanc Seing, and talk a little bit about how it can reveal some brain lessons. Scene 1. Horse and rider pass through a stand of trees on a tranquil fall day. Okay. Anything surreal in this image? No. I'll give you a hint. I doctored this image. But the thing to notice here is that without having to verbalize it as I just did, you immediately understand it to be a tranquil fall day. We see there is still green grass, but there's some brown orange leaves in the grass. There's nothing flying in the air. Doesn't appear to be wind. So, in a few simple gestures or lack of, he conveys a lot of information about the scene. Let's go to scene 2. Something's going to change. Tell me what's changed. Anybody? Exactly. Something's weird with this tree. Well, that's not the original painting. Let's cut to the chase. Scene 3. And now, this is the original painting. Now some really weird stuff is going on here. You've still got that weird tree, and now you've got something even more bizarre going on. A broken horse. So, oh, by the way, in my research about this painting, I discovered this quote of Magritte that I just had to share. I just love this. A tree is an upsurge from the earth towards the sun. A tree is an image of a certain happiness. Isn't that great? So Magritte constructs a very vivid 3D scene in our heads and then proceeds to mess with it. Now, remember, we only have 2 dimensions of light falling on the retina. You have to construct the 3rd dimension, and any good artist knows the tricks of how to induce that in your brain by daubs of paint on a canvas. So we have size and relative size convey depth and distance. Things that are closer tend to be larger. Texture gradients, like the grass and leaves in the foreground, are coarser texture. We have atmospheric haze. In the background, it's hazy and lower contrast. We have linear perspective. We have shape from shading. Any good artist knows if you don't want people to see flat planks of wood, you better shade those trees. And then, of course, as we talked about before, there's occlusion and completion, telling you what is in front of what is behind what. And every one of these cues wouldn't actually serve as a cue about depth and distance unless, every one of these cues is carried by a different module in your brain. Now, I thought more about this idea of occlusion and completion, and I realized, wait a minute, a painting is 2-dimensional, right? So nothing is really in front of anything else. Except at a very small scale of paint thickness. So in order for the effect to occur, for the artist to be successful in creating these illusions, he or she has to paint things such a way that your brain is able to identify and segregate objects, decide successfully, or in his case, not successfully because he's going to mess with you, decide what is figure and what is background, and then arrange objects in some vivid 3D scene. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense to talk about occlusion in a painting. And each of these has a special brain module controlling it. So let's dive down into some of the surreal effects. He's gone and deliberately messed with the 3D scene he's so meticulously created for us. So I've numbered some of the trees here, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. The first surreal element I want to talk about is this weird, impossible tree. It starts out at the base, far behind the other trees, and certainly far behind the horse and rider. And yet, it somehow ends up in front of the horse and rider. Right? Now, that leads one, if you stare at this long enough, to see the tree as literally bent, convex, because it's distant near the base, it's distant near the treetops, and it's much closer to us perceptually in the center, so that you now have a convex tree. So it's the perceived depth and distance that he has sculpted in our brains that literally has the power, to distort a familiar object like a straight vertical tree. Now, the next surreal element is that weird left rear leg. It's starting out behind the very distant tree 3 and somehow winds its way in front of tree 1, which of course, it must be a rubber leg, right? How could it do that? And yet, we still accept it as part of the horse, even though it violates our understanding of horse anatomy and maybe physics. Now, the reason that we cannot help but seeing it as part of the horse is, as I told you, the brain prioritizes maintenance of object integrity. It refuses to see it as some other, like, it just happens to be a horse-colored limb floating in space. No, we cannot see it that way. In fact, we can't even see its connection to the horse because it's blocked by the tree. Nevertheless, distorted as though we still see it as part of the horse. And then there's the most surreal element of the painting, what I call the empty space become occluder. The space between trees 1 and 2 comes to be seen like an occluding foliage-colored ribbon, intermittently, causing a figure ground reversal in that region of the painting. Right? So, again, object integrity wins. You cannot see that as 2 separate horses or a broken horse. And nevertheless, all of the local visual cues in the painting are driving you to see this as background foliage. So, the foliage here just above the horse and the foliage here just below the horse is the same chromatic and spatial structure as the foliage in the middle. But yet, for those fleeting moments when you see it as if it were a ribbon of some sort, occluding reins, left hand, and horse, then you see it as a solid opaque object that happens to be foliage colored. Visual completion of the horse forces us to intermittently have this bistability of the understanding of figure and ground in this region of the painting. And then, of course, if you stare at this long enough, only about 4 or 5 years, like I did, empty space starts to seem curved, right? It's distant here, it's in the background, here it's in the background, but here it's in front of the horse, right? Now, some people don't see that. It really took me a long time to see that. Look what happens if I just block that empty space with a tree, and I bring tree number 3, the weird tree, back in front of the leg like it's supposed to be. All the surreal elements are gone, pretty much, right? It's his manipulation of space in your head that causes the surreal effects that we experience. If I take the tree away, we're back to surreal. Some features in this painting are generally not even noticed. Notably, for me, shadow information is not noticed. He has placed 6 shadows here, 4 behind the bases of 4 trees, and 2 of them behind the hooves of the horse, the left front and the right rear hoof. The source of light obviously seems to be coming from high up and above, right? Where are the other shadows? Where are the shadows from this part of the leg, or the top of the horse, or a big branch just above them? We don't see shadows. So I think Magritte deliberately left them out, knowing we might not even notice, and B, it might clutter the scene. I want to point out 2 elements of two of these shadows that illustrate what I call subtle painterly gesture, meaning when small details have really large perceptual impact. So, for example, these 2 shadows behind the hooves of the horse, those 2 little shadows and their placement serve a very important function. They glue the horse and rider to the ground, right? Otherwise, the horse and rider might appear to be floating. Now, I have to take a slight digression because when I was reading about this painting in a very thick book about Magritte, Sarah Whitfield says in one sentence, she says that some guy named Patrick Hughes, some artist, told her that he thought the source of this painting might have come from a brief scene in a 1924 silent German film by Fritz Lang called Siegfried. So I went onto YouTube and I looked up Siegfried, and lo and behold, there it was, a 2.5-hour film. I started to play it, not knowing what I would see or when it might occur in 2.5 hours. Play the film, please. Thank you. The music is irrelevant. So about 16 minutes into the film, look what happens. I started screaming at my monitor, Sarah Whitfield never saw this. And she refused to even talk to me about it. I'm not interested. And then I took a screenshot I stopped the film and took a screenshot, and now I'm going to overlay on top of this, fade in and out, a black and white version of Magritte's painting. So just pay attention to the details, including that little funny hat. Now, I admit it's not perfect, but it is so provocatively similar that I find it hard to believe that he didn't see this film and that this somehow inspired this painting. There even some of the trees kind of line up, just amazing. And Sarah Whitfield had no interest in this. What do you know? You're a vision scientist. Let's move on to another incredibly important painting by him, The Human Condition, which is literally a study on the nature of representation, both in art and in the brain. And he was quite explicit about this. It's one of his most philosophical works. And here it is. Well, actually, you know me by now, so I actually messed with it. That's not the original painting. But before I reveal the original painting, which are very subtle changes, when I showed this to some experts and some very, very smart graduate students in visual neuroscience, I got responses like, "I don't know, Professor, I'm confused. What is, I'm not sure what I'm looking at. What is that brown thing floating in the sky?" Okay, I'm sure there are lots of artists in the room and you know that that's the clamp on the easel, right? So when I click, you're going to see, I'm going to reveal what I changed in the painting. Here we go. Not a gigantic change, but I did block out this section, and I did block out that section. So there's a lot of mischief going on in this painting, delightful mischief that is very provocative intellectually, philosophically, and otherwise. First of all, he guides us very strongly to perceive the object in the room as an opaque canvas. And he uses 7 cues to guide you, or force you even, to see it as an opaque object. Let's take a closer look at what those are. So the first 3 are that the invasion into the curtain, like I showed you. And then he's even gone to the trouble of painting a little shadow under the clamp, which of course implies that it's a shadow on something, opaque paint on an opaque canvas. These 2 little indentations into the curtain, what they do is they establish the border ownership of this border as being owned by the canvas, not by the curtain. In other words, they force you to understand it as something in front of the curtain, thus establishing that it is an opaque object, and our understanding of the opacity, in a sense, propagates across the whole canvas. Now, these tiny features illustrate again what I call the power of subtle painterly gesture, when very small details have outsized perceptual impact. I said there were 7 cues that guide you to seeing opacity. So here's the others. The 2 lines at the top and the bottom here, and of course the white edge of the canvas. All of these, anything that you know about painting canvases, he's guiding you to see it as opaque, opaque, opaque. But I said there were 7. So what is the 7th? The most important cue that proves to our brains that this is an opaque object. Anybody? See, people don't just call it out. And I've had artists fail to think of it. I've had vision scientists studying art fail to think of it. The disappearance of the easel, folks. It's the most profound cue that it is an opaque object. And so many people don't even notice that. And then he goes and guides you to see it as transparent. And how does he do that? Well, he uses the Gestalt laws of continuity to guide you there, even though he doesn't really care about Gestalt laws. This is my interpretation of the devices he's using that actually work. So, for example, there's 3 clouds, the outlines of which traverse the boundaries of the canvas. This cloud, and that cloud. And they follow along approximately a reasonable trajectory after they pass the border that you can accept. There's no discontinuous behavior at the border. Likewise, the distant line of trees traverse the right edge of the canvas, the mound of bushes, the dirt path, and the grass borders. And all of these guide you to see the canvas intermittently as if it were a window to the outside scene, because all of these elements seem to be perfectly harmonious with as if you were seeing the bushes behind the canvas. In fact, even the tree that doesn't come anywhere near the edge of the canvas, we come to accept as if we're seeing it through the canvas. And he sets up this brain battle between transparency and opacity, which we experience as surreal. And this sets up some really interesting and odd paradoxes that takes a long time for you to think about these. So during those transient moments when you see it almost as if you're seeing through the canvas to the outside scene, as if it were like a window, during those moments, well, how come you see cloud through here and not curtain? That must mean the curtain's either cut out or it's transparent. Similarly, during those moments when you feel like you're seeing the outside scene through it, where's the easel? Well, that implies the easel is transparent, which of course is impossible. So he set up these contradictions, even though you don't notice them at first. But the more you think about it, the crazier you get. You realize what's going on here. So he was very explicit about this painting. Others like it as a study in representation in art and in the brain. And he even wrote, and I have to quote him here, it, meaning the tree in the center of the painting, it existed for the spectator simultaneously in his mind as both inside the room in the painting and outside in the real landscape, which is how we see the world. And this is the key phrase. We see it as being outside ourselves, even though it is only a mental representation of it that we experience inside of ourselves. So he's very sophisticated in his understanding of perception as representation in the brain. And this idea is very harmonious with modern neuroscientists' understanding of the brain processing. Here's a philosophical thought. Since all of the stuff on that canvas was invention, we have no idea what's behind the canvas. Maybe it was, or maybe it was. Here's another philosophical thought. Maybe the entire scene that we feel like we're seeing outside the window, maybe it was all just painted on the glass of the window to fool us. Now, of course, no one I've shown this painting to sees it that way, and there's a good reason, because, excuse me, Magritte has gone out of his way to paint the stuff that we see in the outside scene with meticulous focus on providing all of the cues that we need to understand depth and distance that I talked to you about earlier. And so it's almost impossible to have the outside scene perceptually collapse onto the pane of glass. But it isn't as if he didn't think of this mischief. He most certainly did. And this is an example of one of his paintings, which has all of the issues raised by the human condition, but in addition adds 3 more dimensions: causality, agency, and implied time. Something and somebody, bird, human, broke the window. Somebody picked up the glass and lined them up, leaning up against the wall, because they don't just fall like that. And there's implied time here, too, because evening is falling, right? The sun is setting. The distance from the horizon in the outside scene is almost the same as the distance from the horizon in this shard of glass. And thus, the glass must have been broken almost right after it was painted. Which leads me to a very brief tour through a gorgeous painting that I have to show you called The Discovery. This exotic, completely unique nude by Magritte it's haunting. We have this almost impossible marriage of oak and human skin. And yet somehow your brain accepts it, because your brain is organized to maintain the integrity of objects. It accepts the marriage of these otherwise incompatible materials, the oak and the human skin. And we know just by looking, in general in life, just by looking generally what the texture of an object is going to be, what its temperature will be in most circumstances. We know what human skin feels like. We know wood does not feel like human skin. So the Nobel Prize-winning neuroscientist Eric Kandel wrote a book about art, and he talked about art that has multisensory elements in it, like this does, implicitly, even though it's not explicit. And he said that art that has these multisensory elements invoke and activate parts of our brain that are tuned to multiple senses. For example, we have cells in the brain that respond both to visual texture and to tactile texture, and probably the same for temperature. And so so he claims that multisensory multisensory aspects of paintings engage the emotional centers of our brain and thus have a large impact on the aesthetic impact that they can have on us. And thus, nowadays, we have burgeoning an incredible new science called neuroaesthetics, studying the neurological basis of art and of the aesthetic experience itself. And here's an example from two colleagues of mine, Ziki and his colleague Ishizu. They measured human subjects in an MRI machine while they were presenting them with a whole series of paintings. And the subjects had to rate every painting on a scale from beautiful to ugly and everything in between. And then they played music and had them rate the music on a scale, an aesthetic scale. And then they looked at what parts of the brain were activated when the subjects had a very positive aesthetic visual experience or auditory. The visual beauty centers are highlighted in red, the auditory in green, and then there was a whole group of cells that responded to positive aesthetic experience of either modality. So you can see we're starting to zero in on a neuroscientific examination of what in the past would have been thought only the domain of philosophy or psychology or art, but certainly not neuroscience. And now there are some incredible labs around the world studying this stuff, which brings me back to where I told you I was going to return. When I was at the Museum of Modern Art, the audio tour, which I normally don't take, but I wanted to do it because I use this painting so often in my lectures. And when I got to this painting, the curator, Anne Umland, said towards the end of her spiel about this, she says, and in the center of this enormous iris is this dead, opaque, black dot. It's like the end of sight. And the visual neuroscientist in me screamed, "What?" Now, I know that Magritte, there is no way Magritte would have thought of that pupil or our pupil as the end of sight. He was much too savvy for that. So my interpretation of this is that if that black dot is to represent anything, I think that Magritte might have thought of it as representing the reality that our inner lives are inherently opaque to each other, except paradoxically, in a surreal fashion, he's revealing to us the inner life of this viewer, namely the clouds in the sky that replace iris. Thank you.